In addition to telling my father's story, to the extent that I've been possible, I've been trying to be able to get information, bring in members of our church family in their service as veterans, or their relatives as veterans. There's a whole lot that I would like to have identified that I haven't identified. One of the things that we did was, well, I'll get to that on the slide. Let me get this moving. Maybe I've got to be closer to this. But this is Armistice Day. I'm out of where I need to be. Now, all of you are aware probably this, by coincidence, happens to be the 100th anniversary of Armistice Day, which we now call Veterans Day. It was on this date 100 years ago that the end of World War II formally ended. The war to end all wars. If we just wish it had been the war to end all wars. How many veterans do we have here? Hardy? How many families do we have here? I see the Nortons. Okay, all right. Well, thank you all for your service. And this right here is a plaque in the back of our church. It's very hard to read, and but my wife and I, Henry Ambrose, got us a ladder, and we went up on it, and we took a whole lot of photos with a cell phone, and my wife shining bright flashlights to get the names off of it, to be able to then type into a Word document. There are a lot of names, family names, that I recognize. Only one member there, though, that I remember. And his name is Lieutenant, it has on the plaque, Lieutenant Landon Daniel. I remember him as Colonel Landon Daniel. So apparently he remained in the service, that made it a career, and retired as a colonel. It must have been longer than I remember. It seems like it's been in the last 10 years, but probably it was longer ago than that. We don't have any information about casualties. That's something that I wish we had. This man right here, I remember very well, Dr. George Mayfield Sr. He was a Vanderbilt professor in Germanic languages. And when America entered World War I, he tried to enlist. He was too old, and they rejected him. So at his own expense, he traveled to France to train Allied soldiers to learn German, particularly those that might be on spy missions. And I thought that was a rather remarkable thing. And although I knew him and knew a lot about this remarkable man, that's a story I would not have learned about had I not seen a documentary produced at the 100th anniversary of the State Bird Club, the Tennessee Ornithological Society. He was one of the 7 founding members of that. A lot of other things I could tell you, but we need to move on. This is the World War II plaque. I am sure with as many names as are on this, there had to be a number of Purple Heart soldiers, either wounded or killed in action. The only one, though, that I've been able to find information about is Peterson Cabot, who was killed in France in, I believe it was in in 1944. It was near the end of 1944. And he was an uncle of 2 of our members, Buster Schull and Paul Stum, and the brother of a very close family friend of ours, Grace Stum. And I'm sure there were other casualties, and I'm going to continue to try to do some research on that. This is a rather famous name. That was a surprise to me when I came upon it. I found out that there were several people in the church who were aware that his name was on there. But Paul Bear Bryant, who was not famous at that time, but of course became famous later on when he coached at several SEC schools, including that one that has the crimson disease, and like my wife. And I could not get a picture of David Hambrick. This is from the World War II Memorial Registry, but this was the brother of Dr. Charles Hambrick. And Dr. Hambrick was here this morning for the presentation, and he was killed in Okinawa, which was some of the fiercest battle of World War II. And this is the brother of Emily Towns. And Emily and her husband were here this morning for the program. And this was about her brother who died when his plane was shot down over Manila Bay. And then there's my father who died on the Indianapolis. And this is his story. My father was a Tennessean. He was born in Clinton, Tennessee, but he really grew up in Knoxville. And he and my grandparents were members of First Methodist Church in Knoxville. That's now in Kingston Pike, but this is the old downtown church. And my father graduated from Knoxville High School. And at age 12, my father started collecting Arm & Hammer bird cards. All right. I see somebody who is reacting like she has heard of Arm & Hammer bird cards, but no, she's shaking her head. But they were a lot like baseball cards that I collected growing up, with information about the bird on one side and a picture of the bird on the other side. You know, in the place of batting average and home runs, it was information like nesting habitat, food that they ate, and geographical areas. But they were very high quality bird prints, and that started a passion for my father, the study of birds. Here's some other examples of Arm & Hammer bird cards. My father joined the bird club, and he was mentored by members of it, and apparently he had the right skills to really be a good birder. Some skills I don't have, like good hearing, good eyesight, and he quickly became quite an expert on birds. And he took a correspondence course while he was in high school to learn to do taxidermy. And with the combination of having that ability and his knowing birds, he obtained a special permit to collect one bird of each sexes of each species. I'm sure there were some exceptions to that, but he amassed a collection of 91 mounted birds, and 88 of those are at or 87 are at the Imes Nature Center in Knoxville. That's a nature center a lot like Nashville's Warner Park Nature Center. And we still have 3 of the ducks at our home. That was a wood duck. This is a great horned owl, and look at the size of those talons. That was one of my favorite birds in the collection, one of 4 owls. And then I know you all recognize this bird. You all have hunted this bird, right? This is a Wilson snipe. So did you ever find the Wilson snipe? But they are in Tennessee. This is probably the rarest bird of the collection. It was taken from a nest near Alum Cave Bluffs on the trail going up to Mount LeConte by a falconer named Brockway Crouch. And unfortunately, the bird died in captivity when it was 6 weeks later, and Mr. Crouch gave it to my father to mount for the collection. And have I gotten too far away? I may have to go to the podium to control this. This next bird is a wood ibis or stork. And most people don't see those in Tennessee, but there are storks here in Tennessee. And my father, while in dental school, did this illustration. And he was so good with illustrations that when he graduated, the College of Dentistry offered him a position there as being a faculty member. He wasn't interested in doing that, and instead he went back to Knoxville to practice dentistry, and starting in 1935. And he continued his birding. Now, this is one of my favorite pictures of my dad because it's taken at Siler Bald, which is one of my favorite places in the Smokies. That's looking directly east along the state line. That's Clingman's Dome, 5 miles away. And Carol, your husband David told me that that was one of his favorite places in the Smokies as well. But that was taken in 1938. And my father loaned some of the mounted ducks to his friend Bob Birch, who ran the sporting goods department in Woodruff's department store. They sold a lot of things in the fall to hunters, things like guns, shells, hunting jackets, and whatever paraphernalia that hunters need. And he would do a display that looked like a natural outdoor scene. He would put corn shucks in there along with the things that they sold. He would put my father's mounted ducks in there. And my father observed damage occurring from the handling of the ducks. I imagine it was damage that nobody except the person who did the taxidermy would have noticed. But his dilemma was he didn't know how to tell him no. And his solution was, I'll paint him some ducks. And so most of the duck paintings were done in 1939 and 40. There's one more we have for 1941. But that's the year my father got his priorities straight. And it was his greatest accomplishment to marry my mother. And they married in October of 1941. And my father was already an officer in the Navy Reserve, and he was called to active duty. And he was one of about 30 dentists that reported for duty on the same day at Parris Island Marine Base, February 15th of 1942. And they lived in this cottage, and they loved it there. They were there for a year. Picture of my mother in front of the cottage. And my mother had taught art. And she encouraged my father to take the painting more seriously and to do things other than ducks. And so he started painting beautiful songbirds, birds of prey, waterfowl other than ducks. And the blue jays were one of the very first paintings that he did in Beaufort. This is a purple gallinule, not a bird that's common in Tennessee, but it is a Tennessee bird. I've actually seen one on my apartment grounds in Green Hills, believe it or not. Quite an accident. I wouldn't go out searching with the expectation of seeing one in Tennessee. An anhinga, magnificent bird, and one of those was in the collection. And pileated woodpeckers, snowy egret. Now you might think the snowy is that you could identify it positively from those feathers that have the snowy effect, but really the thing that confirms that as being a snowy egret are the yellow feet. A great blue heron. This is the first of two hummingbird paintings my father did. This is my favorite of the two. And belted kingfishers, very common on the small streams in Tennessee and lakes. Orchard orioles, cedar waxwings, painted buntings. My father would see these every day, according to my mother, when he and the other officers would ride together to the base at Parris Island. Marilyn and I visited in the home of what had been my parents' best friends in Beaufort. The home was being occupied by their son, who barely remembers my father, but he does remember him. But they had, in addition to one of my father's original paintings, they had this right here, and I'd never dreamed it. This is a hand-painted Christmas card from 1942 and it is if you can't see it, it's a red-headed woodpecker pecking the message season greetings into the wood. My father, after 1 year at Parris Island, received orders to report to the Naval Academy in Annapolis. And then my mother and dad were there for a little over a year, and my father continued with his paintings. This one was my mother's favorite, the Baltimore Oriole, or Northern Oriole, as it's sometimes called. And you might notice that the leaves here are our state tree of Tennessee, the tulip poplar. We have 4 big tulip poplars in our front yard. And then my father did his second of the two ruby-throated hummingbird paintings. This is the first of 3 cardinal paintings that he did, and I think that this one is the best of the ones that he did. This one of the great egret is unusual or distinctive with the reflection on the water, of the feathers of the bird, of the cypress swamp, and very, very different from any of the other paintings. These are scarlet tanagers, barn swallows. Maybe the most unusual thing, this is the only one of my paintings, of my dad's paintings, that has a lot of man-made objects in it. But you'll see the barn, the road, the telephone wire, and fence, and maybe some other thing, a plowed field. And this is one of my favorites, red-breasted nuthatches. And one of these is hung in Reed Hall. Don't know if you've ever noticed those, along with 2 of the other paintings. And these are rails. Rails, most people don't know what rails are, but they are in this area. One of these, the king rail, is a freshwater bird. And I have seen one of those on the creek in front of the Green Hills YMCA. The other one, the clapper rail, is a saltwater bird, but they both can be seen together in brackish waters, which I'm sure that's what my father intended to represent. This is one of the largest paintings my father did of an immature red-tailed hawk. You see a barred tail, not a red tail, because it's still in that immature phase. These are falcons. Peregrine falcons, though peregrine is a British or English name. In my father's day, he knew them as duckhawks. That was the Americanized name versus the English or British name. And red-winged blackbirds, a common bird over many areas near water here in Tennessee. My father thought he should take his turn at sea, so he volunteered for sea duty, and he received what you would have been considered a choice assignment, the USS Indianapolis. And he left California at the end of May, and it took him until the 25th of July to catch up with the Indianapolis, because they would take him to where the Indianapolis was supposed to be, and it would have just left. And then he had to get on another ship. So he was on 4 ships and 1 airplane flight to catch up with the Indianapolis at Saipan. And while at sea, this is when my father started writing letters to my mom from sea. And they are so special to me because they probably represent more to me. I know more about my father's personality, I think, from reading these letters from anything. And it's obviously he took his life seriously, his family seriously, birding seriously, the industry seriously. But I don't think he took himself overly seriously. I think he was very lighthearted and somebody who would have enjoyed almost any circumstance that he found himself in. And 160 pages of these letters were used by the authors of the new book, Indianapolis, and resulted in some of the stories about my father and about some of the other men on the ship. The first month that my father was on the ship, he did this painting right here. I gave it its title when we had it printed in 1995 to coincide with the dedication of a national memorial. And we offered the proceeds of this to help fund the USS Indianapolis Memorial, which cost several $1 million. This would have helped a little, not a lot. And but they ended up after saying they wanted it, not doing it. But it gave me the right to use a gold foil seal of the USS Indianapolis Survivors Organization on it. And you can see that on some of the copies that are available in the lobby here. But this represents the only one of my father's bird paintings you wouldn't call a nature print. I call it a war poster painting. And you see the eagle with its wings spread out, protecting the 48-star American flag, and it's clutching the serpent or snake that's dripping blood. And tied to the tail of the snake is a tiny tattered Japanese Army flag. It's full of symbolism. I think my father was expressing the emotions of the Americans fighting in the Pacific. My father, and this is mentioned in the book about him entertaining the men with bird calls. And some of the other officers, bird calls? He's going to embarrass the officer corps. Well, my father went ahead and did it anyway, and it was a big hit. He would draw the bird and start talking about it and then give the calls. And it was one of the most popular programs that volunteers on the ship gave. And I think one reason for that is it made the men feel like they remember home. Think about being thousands of miles away from home and hearing the sound of a bobwhite or a whippoorwill or some other bird that you were familiar with. The other reason I think that it was a popular program is that my father was able to do it in a lighthearted way. And just part of his personality. And I've heard some of the men talk about attending those.
Earl, do you want to try to hear some of the bird calls? Earl, do you want to try to hear some of the bird calls?
Well, yeah, if you can do that right now, what do I need to do down here?
Nothing, just give me 2 seconds, okay?
The bird call imitations were recorded at the home of a foreign languages professor at the Naval Academy in January of 1944. This is my father being recorded doing imitations of bird calls. Well, no, this is a different program, but some of the bird call imitations are on this.
I never seen my father in person. I was six years old when he was killed. I've heard people say, gosh, he knows his father better than I knew mine.
Earl Henry was 33 years old, a gifted man whose life ended during World War II. But what he left was an amazing body of work from his lifelong study of birds.
He started collecting Arm & Hammer bird cards when he was 12 years old, and that's what first got him interested in birding.
He learned taxidermy first.
He was self-taught. He learned to do it through a correspondence course.
With mentor help from H.P. Ives and encouragement, his collection of mounted birds grew. After loaning his collection of mounted ducks to a wildlife friend for display, he started painting.
But my father observed that handling the ducks every year was causing some damage to them, and so he started painting ducks for Bob Birch to use instead of the mounted birds. That's how he got started painting. The earliest ones date to 1929. Most of them in the collection were done by 1936.
The Tennessee Ornithological Society, TOS, the Bird Club, was beginning, and Earl Henry was an eager participant, later becoming president of the Knoxville chapter. This recording is Earl teaching bird songs. Already in the Naval Reserve, Earl began active duty during World War II. Aboard ship, he continued to paint songbirds and birds of prey.
He joined the Indianapolis July 25th, 1944 at Saipan. And then it was a year and 5 days later that he was killed in the sinking of the ship.
Of the crew of the Indianapolis, 880 men perished, 316 survived. July 30th, 1945. Earl Henry did not survive, but his drawing, American Eagle in the Pacific, did.
My father was the only dentist from Tennessee who was killed in World War II. And the Second District Dental Society in 1946 started a program of continuing education for dentists and dental hygienists, and they named it in memory of my father.
I can look at some of the same birds that Earl painted, and some of the so-called masters were actual masters today who have made a lifetime of it. I was struck when I was right there. And he wasn't his one of the great eagles, it's called American Eagle. And I thought his tail and the background and the reflections in the water was just anybody.
The dentist, who better known for his paintings than his patriotism, a war hero who was a lover of birds. His legacy, a short but full life, a good life, well led, worth celebrating.
I really often wondered what a great artist, even greater artist, he wanted to find when he lived and had time to refine his life to play.
Thank you, John. That wasn't the YouTube video that I thought was coming up, but it tells a lot about my father in a very short period of time. I'm going to duplicate some of the information with the continuance of my program, but thank you for making that work. And so here we go back, entertaining with the imitations of bird calls. After my father had joined the ship July 25th, but in November of 44, the Indianapolis came into its home port of Mare Island Naval Base. That's in the northern part of San Francisco Bay. And my mother joined my father there for 6 weeks. I'm really glad she did. I might not have shown up today if she had not. And Marilyn and I visited Mare Island a few years ago, and even though the base has been closed for many years, a lot of the things, the buildings and all, and the dry docks were still there to look at. And while my father was, during that 6-week period, my father did this painting right here, and actually was a thank you gift for some relatives that my mother and father visited in Fresno, California during those 6 weeks. But in 1945, the Indianapolis went back to sea. It was Admiral Spruance's flagship, and it was a very, very busy time. And there was the Iwo Jima invasion, the invasion of Okinawa. I've heard men, survivors, talk about seeing the flag being raised on Mount Suribachi. And this famous picture right here was made from. My mother, meanwhile, was at her home in Mayfield, Kentucky. That is her parents' home, my maternal grandparents' home. And notice the red brick and the white window ledges. Because on her birthday in April, she received this painting right here as a birthday present with my father writing. They were so busy, and he wasn't where he could buy her a birthday gift. But this represents cardinals and a window ledge of that home. And for that reason, I gave the print, when I had it made, titled Kentucky Cardinal. Now, the Indianapolis was hit by a kamikaze plane the day before the invasion. The invasion was April 1st, but on March 31st, the kamikaze plane hit the Indianapolis. It dropped its bomb right before the plane slammed into the ship. The bomb went all the way through the ship and into the water. And what was fortunate about that was that there was no fire or explosion on the ship itself, though there was this gaping hole. And there were 9 men that were killed, most of whom my father had to identify with dental records. The ship was patched up, and it returned very slowly back across the Pacific to Mare Island. And my father received a 3-week leave, and so he didn't want my mother traveling because she was carrying me. And so they had a wonderful 3 weeks, and they're in Mayfield. And right before my father went back to join the ship, they went to Memphis. My father wanted to see what the dental facilities were like at Millington, because he was anticipating getting the war ending, and he was thinking Millington might be a place that he would request duty to. So they ate on top of the Peabody Hotel. I consider this our family portrait because my mother is carrying me. And now I was not due for another 6 weeks, but my father left like 2 days after this photo was made, and 5 days later I was born. And this was the announcement of my birth, June 18th, 1945. And meanwhile, at Mare Island, the crew of the Indianapolis was spread out all over the country, and suddenly they were summoned back to the ship because they had received a new mission. They didn't know what it was, but it was the secret mission we know was to transport the components of the atomic bombs to Tinian. And it delivered the cargo after 10 days, setting a speed record for ships of that type. And they delivered the components of the atomic bomb on July 26. My father received a lot of mail at Tinian. And one of those had several letters from my mother, and one of them had this photo in it of me. And he wrote a really nice letter back to my mother. He was a tickled dad. If you read the book from Indianapolis, there's a lot in there about that. But from Guam, where the ship went next, my dad sent a letter to my mother with these comments, and he enclosed this calling card, and on the back of it he put that note on there: Earl Jr., if I can make as good a dad, son, as your mom does a mom, son, you'll be okay. Love, Earl. And this is something really, really special for me. And had he not sent that from Guam, then there wouldn't have been another opportunity. On the day before, a few hours before the ship was sunk, on July 30th, I know that my father went to the fantail of the ship. I heard this from Dr. Mel Modisher, who was the junior doctor on the ship and was probably my father's closest friend. And the chaplain, Father Conway, led these services. And Father Conway and Dr. Modisher and my father had something in common. None of them drank. And Dr. Modisher told us when we visited him in San Diego a few years ago that they would, when the men had liberty, that the three of them would go together and try to look after the men that they thought were most likely to get in trouble, to try to keep them out of trouble. And I thought that was really neat hearing about that. Now, I don't know if any of you have connections with Blakeford, or not the Blakeford, the Cumberland in retirement facility. But the brother, if you've heard that name Modisher there, that was the brother of Dr. Mel Modisher. He died about 2 weeks ago. Merrill and I actually attended his funeral services at Belmont United Methodist Church yesterday. He was a retired Methodist minister, as was Dr. Mel Modisher. But the Indianapolis, right after midnight, in the morning of July 30th, that's when the ship was torpedoed and sunk. It was the greatest loss of life from the sinking of any U.S. Navy ship. 1,195 men were on the ship, and 879 men were lost at sea. Those that survived, the 316, most of you are probably aware that they suffered for 4.5 days, not knowing whether anybody was looking for them or not. And due to a number of communication eras in the Navy, there wasn't anybody looking for them, and they were accidentally spotted by a pilot who was looking for really submarine patrol. And it was a miracle that any of them survived and that we know as much as we do about what happened in the sinking. Let's skip over a few years. My mother, after teaching school in Mayfield, decided she wanted to become a medical technologist. Her intention was to go back to Mayfield, but she came to Nashville to learn to a medical technology school. And she lived in an efficiency department less than 100 yards away from the church. So the first weekend that she didn't come home to Mayfield because she needed to study, she walked to West End United Methodist Church. And you saw the photo earlier of Dr. George Mayfield Sr. Mother had met him along with my father at a state bird meet in Knoxville in 1941. And the soloist was Dr. George Mayfield Jr., whom she had not met, but she knew if Junior's singing the solo, the seniors are here. So at the end of the service, she looked around and she recognized Dr. George Mayfield Sr., and that was the beginning of a wonderful friendship with the Mayfield family. And it was the beginning of our relationship with West End, even though my mother did not know at that time that she would be moving, that we would be moving here. This is a beautiful memorial in Indianapolis. This is the front of it. On the back of it, all the names of the crew are shown. And my father still remembered in Knoxville, his hometown. And a few years ago, Sam Venable, News Sentinel columnist, wrote a really nice article based on his recollection from talking to that sporting goods person. And he titled his article, "The Roger Tory Peterson You've Never Heard of." Well, that was a wonderful professional tribute if you know who Roger Tory Peterson was. I sent him, Sam Venable, this newspaper clipping right here, which my uncle had discovered just a few years earlier in some papers from my grandmother's house. And it was written in 1933, 12 years before the ship was sunk. And the content is about this dentist who says, who does taxidermy, who says when he graduates and starts practicing dentistry, he won't do taxidermy anymore because patients won't want to come to a dentist who does taxidermy. But the real significance of this that shocked my mother and me when my uncle brought this to us was who the writer was for the newspaper. It was Kyle C. Moore from Knoxville, at the time a civilian reporter who died on the Indianapolis as another lieutenant commander from Knoxville. You can read about him in the book Indianapolis as well. Quite a coincidence. Knoxville at the Imes Nature Center, they remember my father, partly because his mounted birds are displayed there. But they've even created an Earl Henry birding trail. And this is one of several stands where they have what looks like an open book and has one of the paintings of my father on it. And they've also done a beautiful job, a display telling about my father. This is part of it. And you see a little bit more showing some of his art. Another exhibit there. The dentists in the Knoxville area, which is part of 2nd District Dental Society, have an annual program of continuing education for dentists and dental hygienists. And they started that in 1946. My father was, after all, the only dentist from Tennessee killed in World War II. And this thing has grown, and they will have anywhere from, say, 250 to 600 people attend. What's more typical is like 400 to 450. They had a few more than 400 at the meeting that took place 2 weeks ago. I have to keep up with how many people attend because for years we've been giving everybody who attends a free bird print. And My mother, when she was age 91, attended her last one. She died 16 days after that. But I'm thankful that she was able to attend that because they had asked me to do my PowerPoint presentation during the luncheon hour, and that was the only time my mother got to see this presentation. The service was here at West End, but there was a Navy ceremonial guard that acted as pallbearers for her burial in Mayfield, Kentucky. In Indianapolis, this is a picture of the Indiana War Memorial, built to commemorate the end of the war that was supposed to end all wars. And inside this, there are several museums. There's a small one called the USS Indianapolis Memorial Museum. And this is an exhibit there about my dad that I'm extremely proud of. It's the largest exhibit there about an individual member of the crew. That's my father's dress white uniform, which Marilyn really discovered in my mother's belongings. I had no idea that she had saved this and a whole lot of other things too, but we donated that to the museum and that they have put up. Now, this has been a very emotional year, and one of the reasons was the discovery of the ship, which was actually quite upsetting to me when I first heard about it. But now I think it's helping to bring peace. And you've probably seen all of these photos. They were on PBS. They showed identifying the signs of the ship more than 3.5 miles down in the Pacific. We were really excited about this new book because of the stories that are in there about my father. I've already told you about the authors using my letters that my father wrote. And we've actually become very close to both of the authors through the years. Sarah Vladeck, who had this vision, this dream, this ambition of doing a movie about the Indianapolis, one that really honored the crew of the ship. She is a filmmaker. She had trouble getting financing for the film. And she was advised, if you can write a best-selling book, then we think that you can get the financing for a movie. I don't know whether that's going to happen or not, but if all that ever happens is the book, we are just so pleased because of the nice things in there about my dad. The only sad part in there about my mom and dad is the story of my mother getting the telegram that my father was missing. The tabs in there, this is actually a picture of the Advanced Reader's Edition. And those are tabs that we made of pages that reference my father. Now, when the final one came out, there's an index in there, and it lists every page in there where he is mentioned. It's so important, and particularly for those of us who are Christian, that we seek peace and reconciliation of conflicts. And something my mother did when she worked at the Veterans Hospital Laboratory was she invited a real shy Japanese doctor who was there doing research and his wife to come to West End United Methodist Church. And they joined the upper room class. And for the time that they were here, and I can't remember whether it was 2 years, 3, exactly how many, but that was the most important social outlet they had here in Nashville. And the upper room class and other members of the church welcomed Dr. Katayama and his wife and children so graciously. And when we go to Indianapolis to the survivors' reunions, and I've not missed any of the big reunions since before 2005. She hadn't been coming all this time, but in recent years, this lady right here, who is a granddaughter of Captain Hashimoto of the submarine that sank the Indianapolis, has attended. She's an American citizen. She's married with children, and her family lives on a farm in southern Illinois. and she is graciously accepted, and it's a really, really sweet family. And this is really the completion of my presentation about my father. So